Lilliput, giants, Brobdingnag, detached scientists, and rational horses, Houyhnhnms, to satirize human pride, pettiness, and irrationality from various angles. He grounds the fantasy in realistic detail, like map references or mentions of real explorers, making the satire bite even harder.
Alexander Pope is the dominant poet of the age, despite physical frailty and being Catholic, which barred him from public life.
He achieved immense influence through sheer talent and hard work, living by his writing. His circle included other wits, like John Gay. The Rape of the Lock is considered his masterpiece.
A mock epic about a stolen lock of hair.
Exactly. He takes a trivial society quarrel between two families and inflates it to epic proportions with sylphs, gnomes, and grand battles fought with fans and snuff. It's incredibly witty and beautiful. The source calls it the most entertaining long poem between Dryden and Byron, though apparently it didn't actually reconcile the families involved.
The source mentions a deeper layer to Pope's satire.
Yes, suggesting his vision of the uncreating word, bringing back chaos in the Dunciad, is a profound critique of dullness and the potential loss of humanistic values in an increasingly mechanical commercial age. As an enlightened Catholic deist, he feared a loss of deeper meaning.
John Gay, Pope's friend, had a hit with the Beggar's Opera.
A huge hit. It was a brilliant parody of the then fashionable Italian operas, which Gay and Swift saw as artificial and absurd. Swift apparently suggested the idea of setting a pastoral among London's thieves and prostitutes. It became the most performed play of the century.
And this era sees the novel really take off as a major form. Daniel Defoe is mentioned early on.
Yes, a prolific writer, though perhaps seen more as a novelist retrospectively. Samuel Richardson is key, a printer who turned to writing late.
With Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded, told through letters.
Right, the epistolary novel. Pamela is a servant girl who resists her master's advances until he reforms and marries her. Virtue is rewarded with social climbing, but the source points out the moral ambiguity. Is she genuinely virtuous or cleverly holding out for marriage? The letter format keeps the reader guessing.
His later novel, Clarissa, is much darker.
Immensely long and tragic. Clarissa is pressured by her family, escapes with the manipulative rake Lovelace, who eventually drugs and rapes her. She dies virtuously. He's killed in a duel. It's a harrowing exploration of power, virtue, and resistance. Richardson's psychological depth through letters hugely influenced the European novel, and it provoked Henry Fielding.
Fielding thought Pamela was hypocritical.
Yes, sanctimonious. He started Joseph Andrews as a direct parody, with Pamela's virtuous brother fending off his employer, Lady Booby.
But the parody gets left behind.
Pretty quickly. It turns into a lively road novel, a picaresque adventure, introducing fantastic comic characters like the wonderfully naive and good-hearted Parson Adams. Fielding's Tom Jones is another great example of this form.
And Fielding develops a very distinctive narrative voice.
Yes, the witty, omniscient narrator who chats directly to the reader, controls the plot, reflects on morality, balances action and commentary. The source uses that scene with Tom Jones, Molly Seagram, and the Hitch,
where Tom is thinking of his beloved Sophia, encounters the available Molly, and Fielding just skips the seduction.
Exactly. He just wryly observes they retired to the grove and offers some cynical explanations about human nature and the effects of wine. It's brilliant comic realism, puncturing sentimental ideals. He's often called the father of the English novel for this kind of narrative control and worldly wisdom.
Towards the end of the century, though, a change in mood. The rise of pre-romantic sensibility.
Yes, a shift away from pure Augustan reason and order towards emotion, feeling, nature, the past. It was visible earlier, but really gains ground after Pope's death. Poets like Joseph Warton start preferring Shakespeare's warblings wild to Addison's coldly correct style.
Thomas Warton's history of poetry praises the medieval and Elizabethan eras over the Augustan focus on correctness. There's a growing taste for the primitive, the sublime, the Gothic.
Even the slightly melancholy or irrational. Think of the huge, if short-lived, popularity of Macpherson's Ossian poems in the 1760s, supposedly ancient Gaelic epics he'd discovered. It fed this new appetite.
Thomas Gray is a key poet reflecting this shift. The bard is very dramatic, Gothic.
Yes, a Pindaric ode with a wild Welsh bard cursing the English king from a cliff top before plunging to his death. Very dramatic, very different from Pope. Gray even includes an epigraph suggesting poetry speaks only to the initiated few.
But his elegy, written in a country churchyard, became hugely popular.
Immensely so. Its famous lines, "Far from the madding crowd's ignoble strife," resonated deeply. Dr. Johnson, though an Augustan, admired its universal truths, saying its images find a mirror in every mind, its sentiments an echo in every heart. He felt the reader recognize feelings they'd always had.
And the source notes the poems turn towards the self, contemplating the poet's own death as pointing towards romanticism.
Yes, that shift from the general to the private, personal experience is seen as symptomatic of the coming romantic sensibility and perhaps explains the smaller scope of much late 18th century verse.
Samuel Johnson himself is such a fascinating figure straddling these currents, the raw-boned, uncouth provincial who became the dominant literary authority.
Absolutely. His literary club included almost everyone who mattered: Goldsmith, Boswell, Burke, Gibbon, Reynolds, Sheridan. An incredible gathering. His dictionary of the English language was a colossal achievement.
He knew language changed, didn't he? That famous quote.
I am not so lost in lexicography as to forget that words are the daughters of earth and that things are the sons of heaven. Acknowledging the fluid nature of language while trying to establish order, his definitions themselves are often witty, opinionated, revealing his own Tory politics and moral stance.
His poems, like The Vanity of Human Wishes, are quite somber.
Yes, powerful satires in the vein of the Roman poet Juvenal, surveying the folly of human ambition and worldly desires. A strong moral core like Swift's, but maybe less savage, more melancholic. His private prayers show constant self-reproach for laziness, despite his immense output. The source quotes his moving poem on the death of Dr. Levitt, a physician to the poor, and a late version of Horace contemplating mortality.
Oliver Goldsmith, another club member, wrote The Deserted Village.
A much-loved poem lamenting the destruction of traditional rural life by land enclosures and emigration. Full of nostalgic portraits of the village characters, the schoolmaster, the parson, the inn before decay's effacing fingers touch them.
But it has a political edge, too.
Yes, the nostalgia turns to anger as he sees rural virtues leave the land, linking this loss to the decline of liberty, which he imagines emigrating, warning that states need native strength, not just wealth.
And Fanny Burney represents the novel moving forward.
Yes. She published Evelina anonymously because fiction, especially by women, was still looked down upon in some circles. It's an epistolary novel, like Richardson's, showing an innocent young woman navigating the complexities and dangers of London society, learning discernment, and eventually finding happiness. The source sees her as a bridge between Richardson and Jane Austen, cleverly using the letter format to explore perspective and social maneuvering.
Okay, that brings us squarely into the Romantic era, roughly 1798 to 1832, a period associated with revolution, emotion, individualism.
Definitely. European Romanticism had been building since the 1760s, with figures like Rousseau and Goethe adding passionate love and introspection to the mix. The French Revolution was a massive catalyst. Many young writers, like Wordsworth, felt an initial euphoria. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive. Romanticism became linked with revolutionary ideals, at least initially.
William Wordsworth is central, especially his collaboration with Coleridge on lyrical ballads in 1798.
That's often seen as the starting gun. Wordsworth's poem Tintern Abbey, written that year, expresses this intense, almost religious connection to nature. He feels a presence that disturbs me, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused. Nature seems to be his anchor, his guide, the soul of all my moral being. It's a faith rooted in a natural phenomena, not traditional doctrine, giving the poem tremendous emotional power.
His great long work is The Prelude, charting the growth of a poet's mind.
Published only after his death, it's a huge blank verse autobiography, drafted and revised over decades. The source calls it perhaps the most worthwhile long poem of the 19th century, a deeply honest record of psychological and spiritual development. Even if you're not gripped by every stage of his mental growth, there are incredible passages, like the spots of time, vivid childhood memories, often linked to moments of fear or awe that retain their power to sustain him later in life.
Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Wordsworth's close collaborator, is portrayed as having immense talent but less discipline.
He apparently said Wordsworth was his own greatest masterpiece, but Coleridge produced unforgettable poems. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, the fragments Kubla Khan and Christabel, his Dejection. An ode written after hearing Wordsworth read his Immortality Ode reveals his own struggle. He sees nature's beauty but can't feel it. I see, not feel, how beautiful they are. He lacks Wordsworth's ability to find solace and meaning there.
But Coleridge was also a major prose writer and critic.
Hugely influential. His Biographia Literaria, though rambling and sometimes borrowing heavily from German philosophers, contains brilliant insights into imagination, creativity, the nature of poetry, and symbol. The source credits him with shaping modern literary criticism and influencing thinkers, from Newman to Matthew Arnold. His conversation was apparently legendary.
Lord Byron cuts a very different figure. The celebrity poet, the rebel.
He literally woke up famous after Childe Harold's pilgrimage. His scandalous life, incest rumors, disastrous marriage, exile only added to his fame. Lady Caroline Lamb's description, mad, bad, and dangerous to know, stuck. He became a European icon of rebellion, dying while supporting the Greek War of Independence.
His masterpiece is Don Juan.
A vast, unfinished comic epic. It's satirical, digressive, witty, mixing social commentary with adventure and romance. Byron's own voice is constantly present, mocking epic conventions, commenting wryly on everything from English society to literary fame. The source calls it an epic satire.
Percy Bysshe Shelley is praised for his style, his workmanship.
Wordsworth called him one of the best artists of us all. Shelley wrote in various styles, political satire, soaring philosophical visions, elegant personal letters in verse. While his beautiful nature lyrics like To a Skylark are famous, the source emphasizes the importance of his radical political and philosophical poems, Prometheus Unbound, The Triumph of Life, and his great elegy for Keats, Adonais.
He could be quite intellectually demanding.
Yes, and sometimes abstract. He even poked fun at Wordsworth in a poem suggesting Wordsworth lacked imagination beyond his own immediate situation.
John Keats, who died so young, is celebrated for his sensuousness.
His incredible gift for evoking physical sensation. The source quotes the lines from Ode to a Nightingale longing for a draught of vintage, tasting of flowers in summer. For Keats, hearing a nightingale sparked associations with myth, love, and poetry itself.
And the poem contrasts the bird's seemingly immortal song with human suffering and mortality.
Beautifully. Thou was not born for death, immortal bird. No hungry generations tread thee down. He connects the song he hears to the one heard by emperors and clowns in ancient times, and perhaps by the biblical Ruth, sick for home, amid the alien corn. It's a profound meditation on beauty, time, and suffering.
The Romantic era also had significant prose writers, essayists like Charles Lamb, William Hazlitt, Walter Savage Landor.
Yes, known for their distinctive styles, critical insights, and often personal reflections, what was sometimes called fine writing.
Okay, that intense period leads us into the long Victorian era, roughly 1832 to 1901, covering Queen Victoria's reign. The idea of literature continues to evolve.
Yes. As poetry perhaps became more associated with subjective experience after the Romantics, literature increasingly meant imaginative writing. Nonfiction prose, in the hands of writers like Carlyle, Ruskin, Newman, or later Pater, also became more self-consciously literary, using rhythm, imagery, and rhetoric, distinct from more purely rational prose like John Stuart Mill's. Fiction, too, often relied heavily on imaginative descriptions of nature. Think of the Brontes.
Thomas Carlyle emerges as a powerful, prophetic voice after the Romantics faded.
A Scot. Influenced by German thought, he wrestled with the loss of traditional faith. He saw religion as something humans create to meet their needs, like clothes that wear out and need replacing or retailoring, the central metaphor of his strange, brilliant book, Sartor Resartus, The Tailor Reclosed, a romantic heart grappling with Enlightenment skepticism.
John Henry Newman represents a different response, a defensive tradition.
A master of prose style. He reacted against what he saw as the shallowness of reducing religion to mere emotion. The growing secularism and potential separation of church and state led him and others in the Oxford movement to argue forcefully that the Church of England was the true inheritor of apostolic Christianity.
He feared that liberal theology would dilute faith into nothingness.
Exactly. His intellectual journey eventually led him from evangelicalism through liberalism to Tractarianism and finally to converting to Roman Catholicism, a hugely significant intellectual and spiritual figure.
Alfred Lord Tennyson becomes the dominant public voice of Victorian poetry, poet laureate from 1850.
Yes. His long elegy In Memoriam AHH, written over 17 years after the death of his close friend Arthur Hallam, captured the era's anxieties about faith, doubt, science, and mortality. It moves through grief, memory, speculation about evolution, and ultimately finds a tentative faith.
The source sees it as the definitive poetic exploration of the Victorian struggle between faith and doubt.
Yes, arguing it dramatizes that struggle better than any other work. Auden apparently thought Tennyson the stupidest English poet, but with the finest ear. The source suggests Tennyson was ruminative rather than intellectually sharp, but deeply engaged with the scientific and religious debates of his time. His primary interest, though, was feeling expressed through incredibly crafted musical verse.
But the Victorian era is truly the age of the novel, isn't it?
Absolutely. It flourishes incredibly. The Brontes are key early figures. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, 1847, was a sensation.
That first-person voice, the intensity.
Yes, the story of the orphan governess, her suffering, her integrity, her eventual triumph. Readers feel deeply for and with Jane. She stands up to abusive authority figures, chooses conscience over passion when she refuses to be Rochester's mistress, and declines St. John Rivers' proposal because he wants a missionary helper, not her.
And she returns to Rochester only when she can do so on her own terms. The source says she deserves her happiness, unlike some lucky Dickens heroes, though Matthew Arnold found her mind full of hunger, rebellion, and rage.
There's that tension between her outward piety and inward fire, which some critics found problematic, similar to the debates around Richardson's Pamela.
And then there's Charles Dickens, probably the most famous Victorian novelist.
Immense narrative energy, unforgettable characters, a powerful social conscience. He was a phenomenon, famous for his public readings. The source highlights Great Expectations, 1861, as perhaps his most artistically controlled novel.
Told through Pip's eyes, his journey from the marshes to London society.
Yes, raised by his harsh sister and the kind blacksmith Joe, Pip inherits money mysteriously, assumes it's from the eccentric Miss Havisham, and becomes ashamed of his humble origins. His expectations lead him astray.
The source praises how integrated the novel is. Even the seemingly episodic bits, like Wemmick's quirky home life, serve to highlight the human values Pip is losing. It critiques worldly success subtly.
Dickens was called the inimitable. His prose has such life. But the source also adds some caveats, suggesting comparisons to Shakespeare are damaging, that his vision could be sentimental or melodramatic, and his female characters often weak. Thackeray apparently wept at the death of little Paul Dombey, calling it stupendous. But the source notes that kind of pathos feels less powerful now.
William Makepeace Thackeray offers a different flavor of Victorian novel.
More overtly satirical, perhaps more worldly wise. He often addresses the reader directly, creating a sense of shared understanding of human foibles. Vanity Fair, subtitled A Novel Without a Hero, gives this panoramic view of society.
Following characters like the ambitious, amoral Becky Sharp and the loyal, passive Amelia Sedley through the Napoleonic era.
Exactly. Contrasting their fortunes, showing the world as a vanity fair where people pursue status, wealth, love. The source highlights the famous scene during the Battle of Waterloo, where Amelia prays for George while he lies dead, and the later confrontation where Rawdon discovers Becky with Lord Stein.
Thackeray leaves moral judgments ambiguous.
Often, yes. Was Becky innocent with Stein? Did she genuinely feel for Amelia? The novel implies deeper moral standards by exposing the flaws of conventional ones. It's a mix of wit, drama, cynicism, and underlying feeling that the source finds complex and moving.
George Eliot, Marianne Evans, brought a new intellectual depth and psychological realism to the novel.
Very much so. The source connects her to Wordsworth, seeing her interest in how early experience and nature-shaped character as bringing romantic inwardness into prose fiction. Highly intelligent, self-educated, she lost her evangelical faith, but sought to build a humane morality based on sympathy, duty, and understanding, informed by science and philosophy.
So her novels explore complex moral choices within realistically drawn provincial settings.
Yes, often keeping her own agnosticism somewhat veiled behind the ethical framework her characters navigate in novels like Middlemarch or The Mill and the Floss.
The Victorians also basically invented modern children's literature. Lewis Carroll.
Charles Dodgson, yes.
Yeah.
Alice's adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass are unique, full of parodies, logic puzzles, linguistic games like defining portmanteau words. Crucially, unlike most Victorian children's books, they don't try to teach moral lessons. They're about imagination and nonsense.
Moving to the later Victorian period, we have Thomas Hardy.
Known for his novels set in the fictional county of Wessex, exploring themes of fate, environment, and social constraints. The Mayor of Casterbridge is called a balanced tragedy, while Tess of the D'Urbervilles is perhaps his most powerful and controversial.
Subtitled A Pure Woman, despite Tess being seduced, having an illegitimate child, and eventually committing murder.
Exactly. Hardy traces her tragic path, victimized by Alec d'Urberville, abandoned by her idealized husband Angel Clare, driven back to Alec by poverty, killing him in desperation, finally captured and hanged.
In that final line.
Justice was done, and the President of the Immortals, in Aeschylean phrase, had ended his sport with Tess. It outraged many readers, seen as an attack on God, morality, society. Hardy seems surprised by the reaction, but the source suggests it reflects a growing gulf between traditional beliefs and Hardy's own bleak post-Christian worldview. He couldn't forgive God for not existing, essentially. Robert Louis Stevenson is another late Victorian known for adventure stories.
Treasure Island, Kidnapped. Wonderful yarns written in a vivid economical style. His own adventurous life battling ill health adds to his legend. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is iconic, though the source suggests it might disappoint on a rereading, like Dracula. His later South Seas stories anticipate Conrad, and the source notes fellow Scott Arthur Conan Doyle creating Sherlock Holmes around the same time.
Oscar Wilde brings a very different sensibility, wit, aestheticism, drama. Yes, the master of the epigram. His comedies like An Ideal Husband, and especially The Importance of Being Earnest, are highlights. Earnest isn't really satire, the source argues, but uses high society as a setting for a brilliant artificial world of pure verbal wit.
Lady Bracknell's lines are legendary.
To lose one parent, Mr. Worthing, may be regarded as a misfortune. To lose both looks like carelessness. Or praising Cicely's habit of lying about her age because accuracy looks so calculating. Wilde elevates style over sincerity as the vital thing, a logic perfectly suited to his dazzling comedy.
A.E. Housman's A Shropshire Lad offers a contrast, brief, poignant poems of pastoral nostalgia and lost youth.
That famous stanza, "Into my heart an air that kills." Very evocative. The source does note a tendency towards self-pity in Hardy, Wilde, and Housman that isn't always resisted.
And Rudyard Kipling. Mentioned here, but discussed more later, the era ends with the sense of transition.
Yes, alongside the aesthetes, you have ruggedly earnest poets like W.E. Henley, I am the master of my fate. The ground is shifting towards the 20th century.
Which brings us to the Edwardians and the rise of modernism, roughly 1901 to maybe 1927 or so.
Thomas Hardy was still writing major poetry then, like his huge verse drama, The Dynasts, about the Napoleonic Wars. Epic scope, maybe comparable to Pound or Eliot in ambition, though rarely read now. His best poems are scattered across many volumes.
Joseph Conrad, the Polish-born master of English prose, is crucial here, Heart of Darkness.
Based on his own traumatic trip up the Congo River. It's a journey into the darkness of colonialism and the human soul. Kurtz, the brilliant European agent gone savage, embodying the corrupting influence of absolute power in the jungle.
And Marlowe, the narrator, who tells the story years later, still haunted by it.
Yes, Marlowe is impressed against his will by Kurtz's intensity, even his final whisper, the horror. The horror. He can't bring himself to tell Kurtz's fiancée the truth, lying that his last words were her name. The story ends with the Thames itself seeming to lead into an immense darkness, a profoundly unsettling work.
Ford Madox Ford, who collaborated with Conrad, is also significant.
Known for his Tietjens tetralogy, Parade's End, about an honorable Yorkshire squire navigating marriage breakdown and the First World War. Also for his charming, perhaps unreliable, literary memoirs. The source notes his later prose captures the sound of his voice, reflecting a wider shift towards writing that connects with contemporary speech patterns, happening even before 1914.
Then comes modernism itself, that period around the First World War, a label of convenience.
Very much so, the source says. Not a unified movement with a manifesto, more a widespread feeling among ambitious writers that the old forms, the old ways of seeing and writing, just weren't adequate anymore. Driven by massive social, political, technological changes, the trauma of the war, new ideas from Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche, challenging old values.
So they broke with conventions, experimented radically.
Yes. Think Picasso in painting, Stravinsky in music, Eliot and Pound in poetry. It felt revolutionary then, but modern art quickly became just another historical label. The source cautions against overly neat historical narratives, pointing out that modernist poets were sometimes published alongside more traditional Georgian poets.
D.H. Lawrence is a major novelist of this period, though perhaps less focused on aesthetic experimentation.
More of a prophet, interested in emotional impact, psychology, the life force. His first major novel, Sons and Lovers, is deeply autobiographical, drawing on his own upbringing in a mining village, exploring the intense, damaging relationship between a sensitive son and his possessive mother, and his subsequent struggles with love.
James Joyce, the Irish writer, is arguably the ultimate modernist innovator.
A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is another semi-autobiographical novel, showing Stephen Dedalus rejecting family, nation, and church to become an artist, vowing to use silence, exile, and cunning.
Joyce lived in relative poverty, teaching English abroad, but produced 3 masterpieces in quick succession.
First, Dubliners, stories written earlier but delayed in publication. Realistic, often bleak sketches of paralysis and ordinary Dublin lives, meticulously crafted with symbolic layers. Then Portrait, and then the colossal Ulysses in 1922.
Which famously chronicled a single day, June 16, 1904, in the lives of Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus in Dublin, paralleling Homer's Odyssey.
Yes, from the opening lines about stately, plump Buck Mulligan. The source emphasizes you don't need to know Homer or Shakespearean biography or Dublin geography to read it, though they're all woven in. It uses everything from newspaper layouts to stream of consciousness to nightmare sequences.
But it requires effort and a sense of humor.
Definitely. A relish for language, tolerance for Joyce's often obscure jokes and parodies. You can't read it just for the plot. The texture is dense, demanding. The source calls it brilliant, comic, puzzling, sometimes showing off, but ultimately creating its own intricate world, a landmark of modernism.
Okay, briefly touching on the later 20th century and beyond, W.B. Yeats, another Irish giant, had his biggest impact after 1920, becoming a major influence.
Yes, Pound admired his early work, but Yeats evolved, shedding dreamy Celtic twilight for a harder, more modern style, becoming a master for poets like Eliot and Auden.
W.H. Auden himself is highlighted for his versatility.
Poet, playwright, librettist, critic. He brought everyday modern life maps, pylons, factories into poetry. His early work engaged with psychoanalysis and left-wing politics, but he later moved towards more philosophical and Christian themes after moving to the U.S. and confirming his Anglican faith. Known for his intelligence, technical skill, and distinctive, often conversational voice.
What about the novel after the high watermark of modernism?
The source mentions writers who continued in more traditional veins or adapted modernist techniques. Anthony Powell's multi-volume A Dance to the Music of Time, influenced by Proust. Henry Green's elliptical, stylish novels. Ivy Compton Burnett's dialogue-driven novels of Victorian family secrets. Elizabeth Bowen praised for her subtle exploration of social nuances and emotional truths, often focusing on young women's loss of innocence, seeing the novel as a non-poetic statement of a poetic truth.
William Golding, Nobel Prize winner.
Not a simple moralist, the source says. Lord of the Flies uses the boys' adventure story format to explore darker truths about human nature. The Inheritors imagines the world through the senses of Neanderthals encountering Homo sapiens. He embeds allegory in vividly realized settings.
The source brings up Graham Greene's idea that the loss of religious belief makes human actions seem less significant, impacting the novel form.
Yes, suggesting that as society moves away from the Christian framework that shaped self-understanding, it becomes harder for the traditional realist novel, focused on social manners, to convey deeper meanings. Novelists seeking profundity might need to borrow symbolic techniques from poetry or drama.